Over the past month, we have highlighted the crackdown that's taking place on church leaders in China, and more surprisingly, that is happening in South Korea. And there's some more troubling developments that would certainly suggest that what we've been seeing recently in the two countries may be the beginning of a very concerning sea change that's taking place. And joining me now to discuss this is Asia expert Gordon Chang. He's a senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute and author of Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. And by the way, you can follow Gordon on X under the handle Gordon at Gordon G. Chang. Gordon, welcome back to Washington Watch. A lot going on.
Well, thank you so much, Jody. And yes, there is a lot going on.
All right, let's start with South Korea. I think this is probably taking a lot of people by surprise, but the former prime minister there and the former National Intelligence Service chief were arrested today. What can you tell us about that? What's going on?
Yes, about 100 police officers swarmed the house of former Prime Minister Wang, and they were charging him essentially with what they charged President Yoon before, and that is aiding an insurrection. Now, that's ridiculous. This is a bogus charge. But what they're going to do to the prime minister is essentially the same as the previous president, and that they're going to hold him indefinitely on charges. And this is going to be clearly persecution. And this is just a part of a broader crackdown on freedom and on religion in South Korean society. President Lee Jae-myung is a ruthless leftist, and many of his senior advisors are essentially communists.
It's so troubling and unexpected. I think for a lot of people, this is kind of blindsided us. I think even more troubling is the new president has told his police force that hate speech and misinformation that's shared on social media must be considered a hate crime that goes beyond the limits of freedom of expression. He went on to say that it's a threat to democracy and that it deserves to be punished severely. What does that tell us about who this individual is?
Well, Lee Jae-myung is a leftist. There have been previous leftist presidents in South Korea before, 3 of them. But Yi is much more ruthless, he's much more determined, and he's probably much more of a communist than his predecessors. And what Yi was referring to there is essentially speech against China. People in the streets say CCP out. And they consider that to be hate speech. Now, you can say the worst things about the United States on the streets of Korea, and they won't let you, they'll let you go. So demonstrations against the United States are permitted. Demonstrations against China are not.
Is there going to be any cozying up to North Korea, do you think?
Well, there will be, because Yi is a leftist, and they have actually started initiatives with regard to North Korea. And that has been true of previous leftist presidents in South Korea. But what Yi is doing, which is basically new, is really going fast to a relationship with Beijing. Now, previous leftists have had relationships with the Chinese, but Yi has gone much further. And that means we could end up with a military alliance with a country that is allied, in effect, with China.
Wow, a lot at stake here. So let me ask you this. We've just seen, just to kind of put a little perspective on this, we've just seen the Democrat socialist Mamdani elected as the new mayor of New York. Is what's happening in South Korea a warning to us of what happens when you allow pro-socialism, pro-communism elements to infiltrate the government? Is this an example of what could happen?
Oh, absolutely. And in South Korea, it's even worse, because what we have seen in national elections throughout this decade is severe cases of irregularities, widespread cheating. And because the leftists control the National Election Commission, there have been no investigations of this. So basically what happened in this year in the special presidential election was a lot of fraud. Lee Jae-myung was elected president. He is now using the levers of government to turn South Korea from a democracy into at least an authoritarian state. And Jody, this is a possibility that South Korea will become a totalitarian state. We just don't know where this ends. And yes, we've seen the same thing in the United States with people who've been elected. Fortunately, we have more checks and balances in our country. We'll be able, I think, to restrain Mandami. But in South Korea, there's no restraining Lee Jae-myung and the communists that were elected along with him.
Yeah, and it's not just South Korea. I mean, we're seeing more aggression in China, arresting more Christian leaders. Recently, an unregistered house church there. What do you know about that?
Yeah, about 2 weeks ago, there was a crackdown where 30 pastors were swept up. One of them was a large, what's a church, which was not part of the state's church system. In China, they've got 5 so-called patriotic churches. And if you're in, for instance, the Protestant patriotic church, when you go to services, you don't worship Jesus Christ. You worship Xi Jinping. They have changed the Bible. Wow. They have replaced pictures of Jesus with those of Xi. This really is a takeover of religion. And that's why people don't go to the state churches. They go to the underground ones. And we saw the pastors from the underground churches being swept up this month.
Wow. Less than a minute to go before a hard break, but there's also a shakeup in the military in China. Real quickly, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the New York Times says that it was Xi Jinping who's been shaking up the military. We saw in the middle of last month, 9 senior officers were removed. But there's evidence to suggest that Xi Jinping's adversaries have been sweeping up Xi Jinping's supporters in the military, not Xi Jinping sacking his own people.
Wow. Yeah, so it's not only his people, but they're a growing threat worldwide, something that we all obviously need to have a close pulse on. Gordon Chang, as always, it's an honor to have you on here. Your expertise is always welcome. We appreciate it. Senior Fellow at Gatestone Institute. Again, thank you so much for joining us today on Washington Watch.
Well, it's been my honor to talk to you, Jody, so thank you.